a book that brought down the Soviet Union. It's a pretty powerful and remarkable thing to say, and potentially, unless you know history, a pretty outlandish thing to assert, but truly, one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, is that very book. And I have a quote here talking about the influence that this book has had on society. Vitaly Kroditich declared, "The Soviet Union was destroyed by information, and this wave started from Solzhenitsyn's one day." You see, I had a hard time deciding if this would be a book that we included in our fiction or nonfiction reading club here on the channel, and I decided to go with fiction for one particular reason. It is easy, accessible. We already have some nonfiction books that we're working through, and it really is a story of something, right? It is not a direct record, but it is a documentation of what the Gulag camps were in Russia. However, it is also still a work of fiction, one that is written by an author who had experienced those camps firsthand, one that shook a nation to the core, and when put against or tried and tested and told, this book has stood up. It has been a true and accurate recount of what those camps were like. And as I said in the title of this video, and as others have said throughout history, this started the wave, the conversation that brought down the Soviet Union. This little book right here, first published in a magazine as a way to take influence away from Stalin. This book was a representation of a single day in the life of a unjustly imprisoned man, a soldier who had escaped across the battle lines, running away from being imprisoned, and then was accused of being a spy himself, even though he was only across the battle lines for a short amount of time, and was imprisoned for a 10-year sentence, oftentimes which rolled over from one to another. This is going to be talking about the life in labor camps, the day-to-day struggle, the thin mash of gruel with a little bit of fish that you get access to, the dried biscuits that you eat, and the feeling of what a day is like in a Siberian winter where you're marched out to churn concrete and build barracks that you will one day possibly be re-imprisoned in. This book, I first read this book while hiking on the Appalachian Trail with my grandfather. I found it at one of the cabins that we stumbled across, and I remember it being a salient and captivating story, but I just recently refinished it, and I'm going to read it one more time as we go through the conversation together here on the channel. And it is a remarkable book, an incredible documentation of not only human suffering and what we've done to each other in the past. It is a remarkably young book, first published in 1962, talking about the labor camps that existed in the 1950s, old enough that my relatives, a generation or two back, were alive and well and saw the influence that this had on the world, and we so quickly forget. This is only 80 years ago, right? It's amazing. Not only how far we've come, but also how much we lose, how much we forget about where the world has been and what we can learn from the lessons of the past. This book, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, is one that I think should be mandatory reading for every single person across the world. A story of injustice, of criminalization, of a government so focused on protecting its reputation and establishing order and not trusting even those that were inside, that they were willing to imprison and torture their own people for a decade. A book that displayed that words were powerful enough that they could take down a government, that they could begin dismantling. The truth was strong enough that when cast into the light, things that were unjust and cruel and off balance and anti-human would not stand. This book is a documentation a historical record, a pinpoint of not only human tragedy and suffering, but also incredible lessons we can learn. It's a story of human resilience, of what you can overcome, of who you can make yourself. This is about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, writing about the camp where he served, I believe, 8 or 9 years. A hard labor camp, right? In the freezing cold, with a lack of resources and a lack of food and a government around you that not only didn't care about you, didn't care about your life, but also was collapsing and suffering internally. The principles that were established in the Soviet Union resulted in the desecration and dissolution of an entire nation. Millions of people died across that stretch of time. They starved to death because the form of injustice that was being exuded was not sustainable. This book, I think, should be mandatory reading. And so I thought it was a good place for us to start. Something right on the edge of fiction and nonfiction. Something that for me, when I started rereading this, I consumed it in just a day and a half. And I'm excited to dive back in. I'm excited to take a pen and write in the margins and comment and think through and reanalyze exactly what this is. This is a lesson of not only where we've been and who we can be, but where we also don't want to go. I think it's one that is salient today, just like it was when it first was published. I don't think we're above where this book is. So, with that, let me go ahead and read the back cover for you, because I do like flavor text to set the tone for what this book is. And then I'll encourage you to pick up the audiobook or go ahead and order yourself a copy. They are very cheap, and get one into your hands. Next week we will start diving into this. I believe there are a total of, let's see here, 160 pages. So we'll go a few chapters in. I'm not sure exactly where that is or if it's broken into chapters specifically, but we'll get about halfway through the book before the next video and then wrap it up in probably a 2-video or 3-video series. In the madness of World War I, a dutiful Russian soldier is wrongfully convicted of treason and sentenced to 10 years in a Siberian labor camp. So begins this masterpiece of modern Russian fiction, the harrowing account of a man who is conceded to all things evil with dignity and strength. First published in 1962, it is considered one of the most significant works ever to emerge from Soviet Russia, illuminating a dark chapter in Russian history. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is at once a graphic picture of a work camp life and a moving tribute to a man's will to prevail over relentless dehumanization, told by a literary genius whose talent matches that of Denisovich, Turgenev, and Tolstoy, and Gorky. Harrison Salisbury, The New York Times. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was born in 1918, a year after the Bolsheviks stormed to power through Russia. He studied in the University of Rostov and served with distinction in the Russian army during World War II. In 1945, he was arrested and imprisoned in a labor camp for 8 years because he had allegedly made derogatory remarks about Stalin. Released in 1953 after the death of Stalin, he was forced to live in Central Asia, where he remained until Premier Khrushchev's historic secret speech, denouncing Stalin in 1956. Rehabilitated in 1957, Solzhenitsyn moved to Ryazan, married a chemistry student, and began to teach mathematics at the local school. In his spare time, he started to write. In 1970, Solzhenitsyn received the Nobel Prize for Literature. 4 years later, the Soviet Union revoked his citizenship and he was deported. Solzhenitsyn settled in Vermont in 1984, but eventually returned to Russia in 1994 after the collapse of communism. So, that should set the tone for you. Let's have a conversation about this book. This book that, according to scholars and history, not only potentially solidified, but at least certainly started the collapse of the Soviet Union.